IoT Unplugged, where we talk to industry leaders, innovators, and major players in the Internet of Things, bringing you the best and latest insights. Tune in to learn more. In this episode, I talk to Dave Weidner, CEO of Pelion, as he shares their view of the eSIM market, its adoption across different sectors, and how prepared people are for the SGP32 standard. Hi Dave, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Caitlin. Glad to be here.
So for those who are listening, could you quickly introduce who you are, your background, and what you do?
Certainly. So I'm Dave Weidner. I'm the CEO of Pelion. My background has spanned 25 years of technology leadership. I've been focused on a number of areas from strategic growth, driving innovation, and I've had a long history of bringing new technologies to market across not only Europe, but North America as well. At Pelion, I've been leading a mission here of how we simplify, secure, and provide scalable, reliable connectivity for enterprises, and making sure that we can do that in a global manner. I'm really passionate about how we actually take those to market, and more importantly, how we drive that next generation of connected solutions. So if you think about items that go into play, IoT is a broad term, but that real connectivity of how you tie together the world we're looking to tackle is an important catalyst if we think about how we transform anything from healthcare, industrial, medical, and bringing solutions across the board.
Great. And for those who may or may not know, can you give a quick introduction to Pelion as well?
Absolutely. So Pelion, we're a global leader in managed IoT connectivity. It's a company that's focused on being able to deliver cellular solutions to companies to allow them to provide scalable, reliable business connectivity, and more importantly, be able to connect these devices they're trying to take out to provide solutions that are expanding and growing exponentially across the world. The background is that we're a company that's been founded in Glasgow, Scotland. We've been here for 25 years. We have innate experience and, more importantly, an expertise of understanding how you actually connect devices and deploy them at scale in this connected world. We bring a platform that allows businesses to not only connect their devices, but also manage and secure them, providing the most reliable connectivity for the locations here that we provide in the UK, but also on a global basis. We also have a flexibility to provide, long-term interoperability and provide a array of solutions that allow you to have not only secure connections and tools, but even to manage and orchestrate those connections wherever they're going to light up. So it's a company that's been built on our expertise, but more importantly, we've been doing this back into the days when it was called M to M to cellular, and now we're in the IoT phase. You can talk about AIoT, but the long and short about this has been we have been throughout that process helping companies get to that scale. More importantly, have an expertise of understanding all the trials and challenges you might face as you think about going to market.
And I'm sure we could probably have a completely separate conversation about the evolution in those terms and the evolution in IoT. Probably a conversation for another day, but it certainly speaks to how the landscape has changed over time. Now, you mentioned you have a platform. I understand it's a connectivity management platform, which is kind of your bread and butter. How would you characterize your approach to connectivity and connectivity management?
So the way we think about connectivity and connectivity management is it all comes back to the outcomes for customers. So when we think about it in a very simple term, it's about ensuring that we have secure intelligence about what's going on in the network, but more importantly, we provide a scalable communication with insights to not only what are your devices doing, but where you might be running into challenges with that connectivity as you make those tie together. When you think about it, it's a very simple approach of being device first in one sense, because ultimately the outcome that the customer is looking for is how do I solve my problem of understanding temperature, the how something is working in the telemetry, how is the device, how is the bus that it's sitting on running. The whole concept of device isn't really the vernacular of the customer. If they're thinking about providing an industrial solution, they're thinking about the pump that it's going to be connected to and how it's being monitored and running. How do I make sure that I maximize the efficiency? How do I minimize downtime? And more importantly, get ahead of when I have maintenance or get ahead of that part of there. So when we think about our offer, it's very focused on about making sure it's secure first and foremost, that we provide a reliable connection that people can trust and count on, and more importantly, give them that ability to control it through a single pane of glass. That single pane of glass is a long used term and it goes across the board, but it is an effective piece. It's having that dashboard and control panel to be able to actually manage the entire fleet of devices, be it the one device that you might have down the street or the tens to hundreds of thousands you deploy across the globe for doing simple asset tracking. So that concept of having built-in security all the way down to the SIM card and into the authentication, having multi-network redundancy. So that second piece is being reliable is that if you think about something being deployed in the UK, for instance, that it has the ability to actually connect to all of the networks here. As much as we think that we have ubiquitous connectivity, all it takes is a small drive up to the Highlands of Scotland to quickly find that you're going to have different connectivity in different places. Because look, end of the day, connectivity first and foremost is built around how we have routes of travel and where people occupy. So when you start hitting these gaps, you start to run into these challenges, but you might quickly find that carrier X Vodafone works very well in this one city. The next place you go over to, EE works, but ultimately the customer needs to be able to have that reliability and connect to whatever they need and can make sure that that works as efficiently as possible. And then finally, we give that these fine grained controls to allow you to manage what your spend is, the data throughputs, putting in new policies, or potentially even changing the actual SIMs or connectivity that you're even using as you think about that. And that gives that secure foundation, but more importantly, a platform that allows the customer to build something and have the confidence they can grow with it in the long run. That's the key piece there, Caitlin, is that they have that the ability to control in the long term. Because if you think about this, and it goes back to customer outcomes, if I'm putting a piece of digital signage out that might be sitting there, it's going on a wall for 1, 5, 10 years. Every time you have to interact with it physically comes at a cost. So that ability to have that trusted connectivity tied together with the software and services that the customer is going to put for that application, it's critical they all work together. But it does start with that having that reliable connection, because otherwise you put yourself in a position you're going back into the analog world where you're going to have truck rolls and things that just impact the entire business case. Simple to the point.
I think when we talk about connectivity, IoT is a different beast because the devices, like you rightly said, when you use the example of digital signage, are going to be put out in the field for 5, 10, 15 years. You're looking at a completely different time scale and you're looking at a completely different time period compared with a smartphone.
Yeah, and with a smartphone, the one trick is that you have a retail shop that the consumer will bring it in, and you have experts there to serve that. When you start thinking about putting, ideas of digital signage, but thinking about doing things with industrial solutions. So we have a customer who's deploying air compressors, and they're deployed in 140 different countries across the globe. Those are something that have to be always running. But the interesting part is, I can't suddenly rip the pump out and take it down to the local shop and ask them why the SIM card isn't seated correctly. So back to your point, when you start thinking about the scale and size of that, it changes the economics first and foremost, but it also is that service model that you can count on and trust this for that 5 and 10 year solution.
One thing you mentioned when you were talking a little bit about your platform, which was positioned front and center, is security. So, how are you ensuring security for your customers, both from a device perspective and from a network perspective?
Certainly. So we look at our security approach as a zero trust approach, and effectively it actually starts from that established connection. We are very focused on making sure that we have ourselves in a position that we have not only a secure network, but that we advise and help our customers with making sure they secure their data from its inception all the way to wherever they're going to be processing that data. It could be at the edge, as you think about that simple piece. But as soon as you want to transfer that data, making sure that they encrypt it correctly, that it's transferred effectively, and more importantly, it gets to the endpoint in a secure manner. That is a critical piece there. We focus our time. We've made very certain that we have the right implementations of network security capabilities that we make sure are there and robust, and always updating and getting ahead of that item there. Our goal is to make sure that whatever the data is that you've decided to secure at the device gets to your endpoint, and more importantly, feeds that solution and runs it through. So security is first and foremost the area that we look at. And we spend a lot of our time helping to advise new customers on what they need to do as they think about that first entrance. But we also work with our existing customers quite heavily to help them to make sure that that security is robust and there from the get-go, that they actually think about that. Because ultimately, That, as you think about the challenge and the risks that you can run into, especially when you get into applications around healthcare and solutions where you start to think about B2B, but there might be an endpoint of a consumer, making sure you have that secure level there and that built-in security all the way from the device up is that key element. Otherwise, you're going to run into challenges with not only regulatory compliance, but you're going to run into challenges of trust and losing that trust very quickly with customers if suddenly you have to talk about a data breach, data leaks. Those are things that you just cannot afford. We've solved these problems. We're able to do that, but it is a constant battle. You need to make sure that you're advising, especially when you think about companies that come in and think of it as IoT in that first journey, they look at it as an IT solution, when actually it's really about the operating and you're getting outside of your traditional managing laptops and cell phones. You're actually in that much broader operational part of the solution that you have to think about in that OT manner. So it fits in well, but that comes into the fact that you have to be vigilant and more importantly, taking that step forward with our customers to make sure that they're thinking about it in a way that makes sense for what they're actually trying to solve for.
Really good points there. So why don't we talk a little bit about the eSIM market? You guys, of course, are involved in eSIM. It's something that you offer. What are you seeing at the moment in the market? What is your view of the state of it?
Yeah, so the eSIM market has been fascinating. It's an area that we have spent a long time actually participating in and built out on. So from a perspective there, it's a market that was promised over a decade ago when you think about the initial launch of the SGP02 standard. What's interesting is we adopted that quite early on and have been building that out and deploying that as a solution for nearly a decade now. As we think about it, our first ones went out in 17, and we've been using that as a lead with solution there. And the interesting part was it was an early technology, a lot of hype, and you get through that initial stage, you look at it and you go, yeah, I'm going to deploy it. There were lots of amazing use cases people thought about, but ultimately it comes down to is that ability to actually be able to provide a solution that you can count on for a decade. When you think about changes that might happen, regulatory changes, so you think about countries that have suddenly gone from allowing roaming, which we were using the 10 years prior, into a country where suddenly says, actually, you now have to be Rome, you have to use a local network, and more importantly, you have to use one that's maintained and actually within the country border. So you see those changes happen. You've seen it happen in Turkey, Brazil's another market, and other markets around that as well. Separately, and more importantly, the other part about the eSIM element that's come into play is it gives you an insurance model so you can think about how you might want to change the behavior of the device from anything from how do I want to think about where I'm deploying today versus tomorrow? How do I manage my supply chain? So in a world that's quite often is you go down that example, you might suddenly have to create 10 different SKUs of devices for 10 different embedded SIMs that you were actually embedding and soldering in, but they were traditional SIM cards that with no ability to configure and drive forward. So this whole premise of having a flexible software-driven connectivity approach where you can actually manage the SIM, manage the profiles, and change the provisioning such that you can actually deploy for the market or solution you're aiming for is a game changer. The market is the one challenge I would say, and we're really good in this market, is that we've had the SGP 32 coming for quite some time. We've seen the adoption of what's called the predecessor that works similarly in SGP 22 in the cell phone space. So for those of you who no longer have to put a SIM card in your phones, originally being from the US, they've ripped out SIM slots out of our phones maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago in that ballpark, which is fascinating. So if I buy a phone here, I get a SIM slot. If I buy a phone over there, you suddenly don't. The interesting part though is they've paved the way and now you've seen the adoption happen that puts in place that you can actually build out eSIM accordingly. The big challenge we had is we had challenges with investment, who's going to pay for it. So suddenly, it put a lot of onus on an MNO to build this out. Comes with a lot of costs, and then ultimately the question is, what's going to be the payoff, and how does that come back together? Because ultimately, you create a solution that might not scale. Now that you've seen adoption of eSIM in the consumer space, back to the earlier part about handsets that you had kind of brought up, that adoption now paves the way that we can leverage those same investments to build out the IoT solution because it's building on a common stack. Great for that perspective, and it opens up a lot more. So the fact that we've gotten away from something that was, while well adopted in industries like automotive at the automotive OEM level, and SGPO2, that original IoT M2M eSIM spec, well adopted there. Now that you're tying it to something that actually ties more closely to what is the consumer spec and how quickly you see those that comes in, it brings us into a position now that with SGP32's arrival, we actually see a path where you're going to see that next step in the scale approach, and it opens up a lot there very quickly.
I wanted to pick up on a thread of an earlier point you made, Dave, which I think is really interesting. Just you were saying, you were talking about eSIM being an early technology, and this question of what's going to happen in the future. And, with regards to IoT, going back to this 10-year time frame, it was difficult to know. So I'm just curious from your perspective at Pelion, and perhaps from your customers' perspectives, when something is new and emerging like eSIM, or new and emerging in adoption like eSIM, what kind of questions do you guys have, and how do you determine when to invest in technology like that?
That's a really good question. It's the challenge of, do you want to be the early adopter and then have to explain it? It's a really fair question, Caitlin. So as we look at this, it's been an interesting technology. We've seen the benefits of eSIM very early on, and the way we made the adoption decision is we decided to adopt it quite early, because what we saw was it helps to solve a challenge that we had faced in the years prior, which is effectively you want to deploy with a solution, you deploy with a network operator X, and suddenly 5 years down the road of a device has a 10-year life cycle, that operator makes a change. They might shut down a 2G technology. They might make a change in how you actually connect. And suddenly you have a device that's sitting there in a position where it effectively might not be able to run. And suddenly you have thousands of devices, if not tens of thousands, that you suddenly have to go manually intervene with. And what that effectively does is it puts you in a position where you're like, well, this investment isn't going to pay off. Effectively, the benefits not only on the bottom line, but the ability to not have to drive around, use petrol, those environmental benefits that you can see as well, and just general efficiencies, they go that way. So when we look at this technology, it's an interesting challenge of being first isn't always, is an interesting piece, because you can be first to a market where you then have to explain it. The challenge we've seen with the adoption has been is that you could try to bring it on, but as operators were struggling to make it available or to figure out which of the three or four SIM providers they were even going to leverage to actually say, I'll support the profile on this operator, or on this SIM provider's technology, but not this one, you started to see a lot of fragmentation. So that fragmentation piece got in the way. The way we tackled it was we decided that we were going to roll it out for our customers by default. So we actually made a decision 4 years ago that every SIM we ship out is eSIM capable, simply put. So we actually took a decision to say it's eSIM capable. If you need the technology, you can turn it on. But if you don't, so be it. It's just sitting there. But what it gave is an ability for customers to be able to react and do things if a challenge came up very quickly. When you look at that technology, though, the challenge is that not every one of the operator partners we work with and networks that we actually bring to market had the same eSIM capabilities or profiles. So you ran into this challenge of, yes, we can do it, but this way, this way, this way. So we advise customers of saying, for what you're trying to solve, if your devices aren't coming back to a terminal every night and you're not restaging them, so think about buses or trains, which are another area where you see in the transport space. And those are ones you could service pretty easily. You could suddenly change out 500 SIMs in a day and service a bus line on a Saturday, and away you go the next day. But when you start thinking about putting things on a pole, 100,000 smart meters getting deployed across the UK, or EV charging, those are good examples of places where suddenly it's a little harder to interact with it. But more importantly, how do I get ahead of that game? So when we've talked about the investment piece, it really comes down to is identifying what use cases will get the most value out of it. The premise that we expect that typically we see 5 and 10 years. So it is that being able to future proof your solution. Where we're at in this inflection point is SGPO2 still has a healthy lifespan, because ultimately it's embedded in a lot of automotive and it's in cars that are deployed, and they're going to have a nice healthy lifespan as well. But as you think about this inflection point we're at and this pivot now to SGP32, the time is right, because now you're going to see more operators make it available. It comes together quite well. The other challenge that we do ourselves a disservice is and it's a telecommunications challenge. We do it in the telecom business. That's what we do is we like acronyms. So we acronym ourselves to death in a challenge of saying, well, what's it actually solve for? And end of the day is, if you think about it in the simplest terms, I give you the ability to actually control and manage what is the connectivity on your device. More importantly, I give you the ability to control that fleet effectively. And even if you want to go down this path, we give you the ability to actually say, look, if you need to make a move or you want to go with a different provider, you don't have the lock-in you had in as well. So there's a lot of advantages here. And more importantly, it puts us on an even playing field with the competitors that frankly, you might get locked into something, but it's going to cost too much money to change. That's not the right way to run a business long term, and more importantly, not to scale in what we're trying to accomplish with the solutions we provide.
I think that's a really good segue then to talk a little bit more about eSIM adoption concretely. So, looking at some sectors, I think when you mentioned transportation, you spoke about telecare, healthcare, and also if we look at industrial, how are you seeing eSIM adoption across these sectors, and how have you at Pelion positioned yourself in response to what you're seeing?
Absolutely. So yeah, if we think about transport's a good one to start with. So with the transport element there, I mentioned a few items, but what you candidly see quite often is you see solutions that kind of have three challenges there in that one. So EVs is a good example. So EV charging is an area we've seen significant growth. And as you think about that move for electrification in vehicles, the infrastructure for charging is one of the big deterrents to actually see that adoption and that change. It's effectively that there's the charging fear. People have a fear of like their phone running out of power. It's tenfold when you're thinking about a car, and suddenly you look at the range and go, I get 110 miles total in the charge if I haven't gone up the hill. Maybe it's 100. So that challenge of charging is an area there where we quite often see that come together. So we've positioned ourselves in the EV space quite interestingly, is that we give you the ability to have the ability to have an eSIM. So as you think about that infrastructure install, and this is a good example, those are going to be there 10 years, not if not longer. Having an ability to manage the connectivity is critical, not only in that you need to be able to do it just to simply make sure that it's up and running and you can get readings, but there's a commerce element as well. So that ability to make sure that a payment can happen, transactions are available, that you're actually allowing the right people on the EV charger. So this goes back into the point of home chargers versus charging networks out and about. So if you even think about your home network, the one where you want to have is that someone's afraid that someone will just plug in and steal, borrow your electricity without paying for it. Steal is the right word there, but we'll go with that one. But effectively, that area there has come in pretty well. So we've seen that in the EV space. And look, the way an EV charger runs, it's a piece of fixed infrastructure that's installed. It has an interesting part because you have the commerce element as well, because you're going to take transactions on it. It needs to be up and running to make sure that if somebody comes up and wants to actually plug into it, it can work, and that you actually know that it's up and running and you got that telemetry there. So having an eSIM is important because of that longevity. But the second part is they also suddenly you start thinking about some of these smaller chargers. You don't want to have to carry 10 different versions of stock because you're thinking about, I'm going to be building it. So if I think about the supply chain side as well, it creates great efficiencies as well so that they can actually think about an EV charger, build once, deploy in the UK, deploy the same model in the US. There's no difference effectively. And actually now you can take a model around and deploy it for the right market there. Similarly, we see eSIM working very well in some areas around transport when you're going across borders as well. So if you think about the logistics, you can still fall into the roaming sim challenge, but what you ultimately find out is the economics will work better if you know you're going to be running between two large, a large border, or you're going to have solutions in the transport space that go across border. Having that ability to make it so that it can seamlessly switch across, and more importantly, get you the best economics. That's a great way to run that as well effectively. So it provides that capability, and that works out well there. Similarly, in healthcare, being able to see this come through when you think about the deployment of all different types of telehealth care solutions, and when we're thinking about remote client privileges, devices come back in. So quite often in the remote healthcare, you're not putting something out there for 10 years. You might be putting it out there for 1, 2 years, goes through a different refresh cycle. But the ability to actually say, hey, I can actually not have to go and touch the SIM and simply say, as part of a refurbishment, I can remove profiles seamlessly and put a new profile back in, and suddenly the device gets refurbished much more quickly, much more efficiently. You're not wasting it. You're not throwing out a piece of plastic and some metal. You got all of those very simple things. It adds up when you think about how much is going on in the healthcare space. So that ability to have that solution that can be deployed. Similarly, when you think about some of these, if it's a wearable, they're going to go across borders. They want to make sure that if somebody's being monitored, they go from A to B, you can still have those efficiencies. That all kind of comes back together as well. And that's the healthcare element. I think the industrial point was the other one that you had brought up, if I remember correctly. And in the industrial space, a lot of this goes back into is that you see companies that have been deploying quite often, they deploy in a single market as a starting point, and then they think about going global. We've had a really good example of that where we've had one of our customers who started with they're deploying in North America and they were deploying in energy, gas, and it's this compressed air solution. They've taken that to over 140 countries and territories that these are now deployed in. They're operating across the globe. The interesting part is much more efficient because it used to have a situation where they didn't know if they were going out, if the devices was at. They had to set up regular maintenance periods, so someone would just fly around the globe. So many different things you think about to go make sure this is up and running. Because end of the day, in manufacturing in general, pick the market. Compressed air is something you'll find quite often in those processes. So that ability to have that solution that can be able to scale globally is important. And more importantly, if I'm going to suddenly deploy it in a market and suddenly it might become restricted, regulatory compliance can change quite regularly. Um, and without warning. And so what you have to have is that ability to say, hey, we can actually just make a change with digitally also eliminates those kind of concerns. So it's all about making sure you have that uptime and running, and more importantly, that you can actually easily change to the right solution and depending on where that device is going to land.
So you've just provided some great concrete examples of how eSIM adoption benefits those different sectors. But if we can maybe flip that, are there any existing barriers you're seeing that you believe to be affecting eSIM adoption still? Like, given that we've just spoken about the advantages, are there any challenges still that you think are affecting adoption more widely?
So the challenges over the last few years, when you take into account, if you take into account the craziness of the last few years from supply chain disruptions, the fact that we were going to have this new standard of SGP 32, which had challenges and delays, and it's technology, nothing there. But what you actually saw was people sitting on the fence a bit and taking a pause of, do I do this or do I do that? And frankly, confusion has probably caused some of those challenges there. So being very clear and saying, look, the SGP 32 has actually made it now. More importantly, the fact that you actually can see it coming to market and getting through there actually helps us much more rapidly see how do we actually take this forward. So that one, like, it's always a challenge of uncertainty will actually quite often create a pause. And if you get three different messages from three different people, plus you're trying to figure out, well, hey, this thing's coming, you see those delays and those pauses. So that's been a challenge that you can quite often find in the net market. The fact now that we've seen SGP 32 getting rolled out, you're hearing about these successful trials and pilots that have gone out the door. And then more importantly, the support you're seeing from the network providers to actually support that ties it all together in a really nice bow. This challenge, of course, is that you play in the game of, if you think about standards versus proprietary, you're always in that bit of a challenge. This has been an industry where, it's an eSIM solution, but it's multi-IMSI, and you can play the word game very quickly, and suddenly you look and say, well, what am I actually getting as a solution? Being clear and transparent, that's the key element here around this. And standards, what they do is they create us a platform that you can build on top of, and effectively then you can innovate on top of that. So it's nice to see that we've actually reached this point. The delays here of understanding the uncertainty, and then sometimes, frankly, just getting out of our own way as an industry is the easiest way to see adoption happen.
Yeah, I think you raised a really good point when you said seeing support of the standard and of eSIMs has probably gone a long way in convincing other companies it's worthwhile investing in. Talking a little bit more about the standard then, the SGP 32, sometimes I have trouble saying it. Talking a little bit more about this standard, how prepared do you think the wider ecosystem is for it?
We're optimistic. I mean, I think that right now the ecosystem's coming together. It's in different stages of readiness. you've got the, like I had mentioned earlier, larger platform providers, the MNOs and leading MNOs, they're definitely taking that forward. You're seeing announcements of SGP32 pilots, and it's coming together really well. We're seeing nice integration, module vendors, ODMs. You're seeing this start to come in and be integrated into the process. I mean, ultimately, it comes back into is it's making sure you have the right SIM that can support this. And these are just some of those challenges of even if you think about stock and inventory, that you have the right solutions, and a traditional SGPO2 SIM isn't there. So it's a question of stock and management on those sides. So you can run into those challenges there as well. And as we see that ramp up, it's going well. The fact that the GSMA is pushing hard on certification, and you're seeing this get to that point where solutions are being certified, announcements are coming through. It's great. Um, Frankly speaking, it's the ecosystem is ready to move on this. The fact is, we're past that early adopter stage. We've kind of gone through and seen it's gotten over the hump, and now it's going to start to steadily ramp as we get into that next step. Um, how would I frame it? I think the easiest way to think about this is, we're ensuring these benefits, but effectively it comes back into is, do I have the benefits? Is it there? And being able to provide the customer the confidence that they're deploying something that is going to be supported for 10 years is the challenge. And now we're in a good position where we see that going on. It's nice to see. It's a good thing to see in a market where you see competitors also pursuing the same thing, because typically if you're one person in a sea of many spouting one thing, you tend to be either too early or it creates confusion and then nothing happens. So I'm actually quite confident we're in a good spot with this now.
Well, I think it's good to finish on that note of positivity. Before, though, we finish, Dave, is there anything you want to mention to those who are listening?
From my side, look, I think it comes back into, as we think about the steps forward here, we're in a good position now as a market and an industry to actually start to see how we can take eSIM paired with the solution, the cellular IoT connectivity we've been providing now as a market in IoT and M2M for 25 years. Um, it really comes back to is that we're in a great position to actually take that forward. And more importantly, you can now start to see that customers are taking their second and third journeys through this. And you can see how they're bringing their solutions to market, not only to scale, but actually they're delivering value and seeing the outcomes. From our side at Pelion, we're here helping to build that future with enterprises, to have full control over your connectivity, and ultimately wherever they're at in their journey, it's an important piece to think about. How do you think about that long-term vision? So, whether somebody's trying to launch a few prototypes or they're trying to scale a global product, considering how you're going to take this forward and thinking about those final steps, that's the key part of how do you make sure that you provide a simple, secure, reliable solution that you can build a business on. So we're here to support that, and more importantly, I'm looking forward to seeing how people take this next step and actually create that next wave of innovation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dave, for being here. I really enjoyed our conversation.
It was a pleasure, Caitlin. Thank you very much.
IoT Unplugged.